When, at the age of 20, I discovered the true meaning of the word projection. Some of you who read my work know that I have not yet decided whether or not to attempt writing my autobiography, the one you might be thinking of, namely the book L'uomo e le stelle, Man and the Stars, subtitled Intervista all'astrologia, Interview with Astrology, which I published in the spring-summer of 2023 with Edizioni di Ricerca Ninti, and which spans 820 pages, is not my actual autobiography, or rather it is, but only regarding astrology. On the other hand, I have not yet decided whether to attempt writing another one concerning the most intimate and personal part of my life. However, perhaps I am moving forward with the work in view of a possible positive decision in that regard. And I would like to tell you how I came at 20 to discover the profound meaning of projection. I mean, projection in the psychoanalytic sense of the term. I was exactly 20 years old, and I was living both inside and outside of myself, the 1968, in a fiery manner. Outside of myself because I actively participated in the revolution of 1968. I had recently begun working at the Modus Institute of Naples, of the National Research Council, CNR, where I was in charge of the Electronic Measurements Laboratory. I immediately threw myself into politics, so much so that by the age of 20, I was already on the board of the CGL Campania, which represented schools, universities, and research. On this board, I stood alongside the man who would later become a famous biologist and expert in biological ethics, Professor Edoardo Bonzinelli. We were carrying out what we then called revolutionary projects. As I mentioned, I was very active on the far left. In fact, I personally defined myself as a Bordiguista, a follower of Amadeo Bordiga. For those who do not know, he was to the left of Trotsky, therefore the most extreme wing. Let's just say that before the Red Brigades, there was me. This was my external experience in 1968. Then there was also an internal experience, because in those months a total revolution was taking place in my life, caused by a bad psychological accident, which I spoke about in a recent YouTube video. Following that event, I suffered from claustrophobia for several years. I became trapped in a train carriage that was overcrowded beyond belief. I fainted and practically spent the entire journey between Rome and Florence unconscious. Then I was hospitalized. In short, I was reported missing. My parents had no news of me for a week. Following all of this, at 20 years old, I began deep analysis. Not everyone truly knows what that is. I sometimes read even about psychologists who believe they have undergone deep analyses, but do not even know what it entails. Some even believe that a psychologist, being a psychologist, can skip deep analysis because they understand themselves on their own. But Jung himself, Freud himself, had their dreams analyzed by colleagues because they knew well that the main obstacle to looking inside oneself is precisely a phenomenon called projection. We refuse to see the gigantic defects we have within us and attribute them to others. With deep analysis, however, one manages to do a work of excavation within oneself. It is a gym for life, which can give us extraordinary results in the years to come. I immediately understood the enormous potential of this path, so much so that after only 2 or 3 months of analysis with a very talented analyst, Antonio Speranza, toward whom I still have an enormous debt of gratitude today, and who is one of the most cultured people I have ever met, I had already resolved my claustrophobia problem. I could have stayed locked in an elevator with 10 people even for 3 days. The others would have hung themselves, but I would have endured. just as today I could easily endure being locked inside even for 3 days. In the meantime, however, having sensed the enormous potential that this path offered me, I continued. And I could never have imagined that I would continue for over 12 years, about 13. Starting from the age of 20, I underwent 3 long, deep analyses, 2 of them with Antonio Speranza. I would like to emphasize that these were orthodox analyses. Orthodox meant, for one thing, that at the time they were performed by real analysts with a full license, because even then there were unlicensed practitioners, as there are today. And secondly, because I did 4 or 5 sessions a week, which involved immense sacrifices. In the meantime, however, I was experiencing 68 within myself, in other ways as well. This window onto the introspective world, onto deep psychology, triggered potential springs in me that were already present and which later found a logical consequence in the studies I began simultaneously with everything I'm talking about. And alongside the 2 great passions of my life, at 20, electronics and photography, I began to take an interest in psychology, in analytical psychology, then in yoga, which I practiced with a certain talent, and in macrobiotics and homeopathic medicine. I started studying chess, and then I arrived at astrology, which I recognized as my true path, the one I would follow for my entire life. During the first months of analysis, which I experienced with great emotion, a very interesting thing happened. What is said during the session then receives feedback during the following night and subsequent nights through dreams, which are our unconscious response to what we have tried to bring to the surface in the preceding days. It happened then, after a few months of being in analysis, that I related to my analyst, who, mind you, was also from the same political side to which I belonged. That is, he was at the time a man of the extreme left. The events of my days. For example, there were joint workers' assemblies between those of us at the Motors Institute and our cousins, let's call them that, from the International Institute of Genetics and Biophysics, which was attached to ours, also opposite the RAI in Naples. In these assemblies, all the 68 of that moment came out. Occupations of institutes, insults to directors, red flags being waved, everything and more. At a certain point, I, fired up, was recounting to my analyst. I remember it as if it were today, the events of an assembly that had particularly agitated me. He asked me, "Why did this assembly agitate you?" And I replied, "Because there is that fascist in the engine room who did this, this, and this. And then there is that other fascist who runs the drawing room, who had the courage to say this, and then there is yet another fascist." And I went on. At a certain point, Antonio Speranza looked at me and calmly asked, "Why do you think you are a fascist?" I jumped up in my chair and said, "No, you don't understand, doctor. I am talking about the fascists who are next to me where I work." And he replied, "Well, but you understand that your unconscious doesn't give a damn about the fascists around you. Your unconscious only cares about you. And therefore, if you're inclined to see fascists everywhere, to the right, to the left, in front, behind, downstairs, upstairs, then it means that your unconscious is asking you, why do you think you're a fascist?" And there, something clicked. Something that then, with years and years of work, led me to recognize which components of my character my unconscious recognized as fascist. Mind you, not in a political sense, because there were no doubts about the side to which I belonged at the time. According to that famous phrase attributed to Winston Churchill, If you're not a socialist at 20, you have no heart. If you're still a socialist at 40, you have no head. This roughly was my political history, notwithstanding the fact that many years later it led me to vote for a long time for Marco Pannella and the Radical Party. But returning to the projection that had generated all this, I recognize which character components within me were comparable to the adjective fascist, namely those intransigent parts of my character that, especially in violent discussions, came out, and which I, at 20, could not control. And this can help, if only partially, to explain why so many people see the world as the sum of many individual fascists, because they do not recognize the fascists within themselves, and therefore continue to insult others by calling them fascists.